You've been lied to about Vietnam. Not because the bombs didn't fall, or because the helicopters didn't thunder over the tree line, or because the maps didn't get redrawn every morning in air-conditioned rooms full of cigarette smoke and confidence. You've been lied to because inside that loud war was a quieter one the Pentagon didn't know how to describe, didn't know how to measure, and didn't know how to control. A war where the jungle wasn't just terrain, it was a witness, a sensor, a weapon. And in that war, the Australians didn't just fight differently. They broke every rule that made the American system feel safe. Here is what makes this story dangerous. The Australians weren't operating from some remote, irrelevant corner of the conflict. They built a base at Nui Dat because it was considered ideal for the kind of counterinsurgency the Australians intended to wage, removed from population centers, but close to Viet Cong base areas. Right in the center of contested territory, where security was everything. That base became the heart of a province the Viet Cong had heavily penetrated politically and militarily. Rainforest and grassland, jungles and mountains, ambush roads. Villages threaded with cadre networks. Was chosen so Australia could operate as a task force and fight according to its own doctrine, not simply as an attachment to American units. So when American officers later muttered that the Australians were doing what the Americans only pretended to do, it wasn't romance. It was professional embarrassment. Because the Americans had a doctrine built for certainty. Find the enemy, fix the enemy, destroy the enemy with overwhelming firepower. And the Australians brought a doctrine built for doubt. Assume the enemy is watching, assume the ground is lying, assume your own impatience will get you killed. The Pentagon didn't just dislike that philosophy. It threatened the entire machine. Because if the quiet method works better in the jungle, what does that say about the loud method? Now picture the first time a U.S. liaison walks with an SAS patrol in Phuoc Thai. It's not the cinematic stuff that hits him first. It's the silence. Not radio silence, the way Americans mean it, quiet for a few minutes until someone can't help himself. This is deeper than that. This is the kind of silence where men don't clear their throats, don't whisper jokes, don't shift their straps, don't let metal touch metal. It's the kind of silence that feels like someone turned the world's volume down and left only your heartbeat behind. And then comes the real shock. The Australians don't move like soldiers. They move like a decision the jungle made. They don't advance so much as they dissolve. When they stop, they don't crouch. They disappear. They become dirt. They become shadow. They become the absence of a problem. And the liaison realizes something that makes him cold, because it turns everything he thought about survival upside down. In this environment, speed isn't aggression. Speed is exposure. That is rule one the Australians broke. Americans were trained to attack the situation, move fast, seize initiative, keep momentum. In the delta that can work. On a beach it can work. In a city it can work. But in triple canopy jungle where visibility collapses and sound travels strangely, and the enemy can be 2 meters away without being seen, momentum becomes a loud confession. The Australians didn't win by moving faster, they won by moving less. And when they did move, they moved with a logic that felt insulting to men raised on getting after it. They timed their steps with wind. They placed their boots like a safecracker feels a dial. They treated a snapped twig like an alarm trip. They treated a disturbed leaf like a flare. The liaison wants to talk about it, ask questions, confirm what he's seeing, but the Australians won't talk. Because talking is a signature, and signature is death. So he learns the way every outsider learns in that environment, by watching, by suffering, and by realizing the Australians aren't being cautious, they're being final. And that's when the second rule breaks. They don't take the shot when the shot is there. American doctrine says, contact is a chance to win. When you see the enemy, you seize the moment. You neutralize the threat. You stop the problem before it becomes a problem. Australian doctrine says, contact is a price tag. Every trigger pull buys you attention. Every casualty buys you pursuit. Every fight buys you a larger fight. So the Australians refuse the bargain unless the payoff is worth the cost. Imagine lying in wet leaf litter while a small enemy element walks across your front. Easy targets, clean kills, a moment where an American unit would happily take the win. The Australians don't fire. They don't even look excited because they are not hunting the men. They're hunting the pattern behind the men, the route, the schedule, the network. And when the larger element arrives, the one carrying the supplies, the radios, the leaders, that's when the Australians choose violence. Not because they're bloodthirsty, because they're accountants. They want maximum effect for minimum exposure. This is the scalpel logic. It's not romantic, it's cold. And it is exactly the kind of cold that makes big institutions nervous because it can't be mass-produced. You can train marksmanship. You can issue equipment. You can write procedures. But you cannot easily manufacture predatory patience at scale. That's rule 2 they broke. The idea that war is won by more men, more bombs, more movement, more pressure. Australians tried something different, less, but smarter. And it worked enough that the entire province began reorganizing around it. Nui Dat became not just a base, but the anchor point for a method: security pits, wire mines, cleared fields of fire, built on the assumption that the Viet Cong were nearby and watching. The Australians treated the province as a living organism. Villages, trails, tunnels, observation points, logistics arteries, and they tried to make that organism sick in very specific places. But then the war teaches its next lesson, and it's a lesson that ruins the American narrative even more. Sometimes, the enemy doesn't need to defeat you. He only needs to let you defeat yourself. It was human terrain, political terrain, village terrain. The Viet Cong had organization reaching into towns and villages, and the South Vietnamese government's authority was limited, especially outside the capital. That meant the Australians weren't just fighting patrols. They were fighting information. Who sees you leave base? Who reports your direction? Who notices your schedule? Who listens to your helicopters and predicts your landing zones? So the Australians break another rule, one that seems mundane until you understand it's about control. They treat secrecy as a form of firepower. They don't want the enemy reacting to their operations. They want the enemy guessing whether anything is happening at all. And that leads to the first thing that truly makes American advisors uneasy, not the killing, but what comes after. Because American doctrine, even in ugly counterinsurgency, still prefers clean categories: combatant, engagement, after-action, extraction, report. The Australians blur those categories. They understand that the jungle is full of stories, and stories are ammunition. And in Vietnam, the Viet Cong's most powerful weapon isn't always an AK. It's the idea that the jungle belongs to them, that they are the natural predators in that terrain, that foreigners are loud prey. So the Australians decide to poison that idea, not with bombs, with fear. Now we arrive at the part that explains your title. They broke every rule, because here is the rule American institutions cannot publicly embrace, the rule that says terror can be a weapon, even when used in a controlled, deliberate way aimed at enemy morale. Americans used psychological operations too, of course. Leaflets, loudspeakers, broadcasts, promises, threats. The Australians did something different. They turned psychological warfare into fieldcraft, into patrol craft, into a language of presence. They made the enemy feel watched, not by airplanes, by the jungle itself. And here's why that was so effective. Guerrillas survive because they control uncertainty. They choose when to appear and when to vanish. They choose when to fight and when to melt away. They choose where the war exists. The Australians flipped that. They made the Viet Cong feel like the ones being hunted. That reversal is not just tactical, it is existential. You can see the environment where this played out in the wider fighting in the long high hills, areas with bunker and tunnel systems, where Australian forces clashed with Viet Cong elements like D445 Battalion, and then brought in fire support against known and suspected fortifications. And you can see the broader pressure in major actions like Long Tan, where signals intelligence tracked Viet Cong movement and artillery became decisive when the Australians were heavily engaged. Another reminder that the Australians weren't mystical jungle men, operating outside the real war. They were operating inside it, but with a different brain. Now put yourself back in the perspective of an American operations officer who has to brief results. He can brief a battle, he can brief an airstrike, he can brief a sweep. But how does he brief a zone the enemy refuses to enter because he believes it's haunted? How does he quantify paranoia? How does he put the enemy stop sleeping on a chart? That's the Pentagon's problem. The Pentagon can handle losses. It can handle heroism. It can even handle controversy if it can control the narrative. But the Australians created a kind of effectiveness that was hard to narrate without admitting American doctrine had limits. And in the 1960s, admitting limits was political poison. So they did what large institutions always do. They compartmentalized. They let the Australians do what they did quietly because it worked. And they kept it at arm's length because it made them uncomfortable. That tension, that mixture of admiration and denial, is where Pentagon hated them becomes true. Not hatred like personal animosity. Hatred like an immune system rejecting a foreign organ even when it could save your life. Because the Australians weren't just allies, they were a contradiction. And contradictions are dangerous to systems built on certainty. Now we go deeper into the mechanics of how they did it, because the next rule they broke is the most counterintuitive to any soldier raised on momentum. They weaponized stillness. Not take a knee for a minute. Stillness so total it becomes a test of identity. The jungle tries to force motion. Sweat drips into your eyes. Mosquitoes bite the soft skin behind your ears. Ants crawl into your sleeves. Leeches search for warmth. Cramps twist your calves. The urge to adjust your gear becomes overwhelming because the human body is not designed to be silent for hours while staying alert. But in Australian SAS doctrine, stillness is not the absence of action. Stillness is action. It is the act of choosing not to reveal yourself. It is the act of telling your body, you are not in charge anymore. And when American observers see this, it's not just impressive, it's alien. Because American training often celebrates explosive action, speed, aggression, violence of action, the adrenaline burst. The Australians train for the opposite, a long period of controlled suffering, followed by a short period of violence so decisive it feels unfair. That's why the Viet Cong called them ghosts in your reference scripts, because a ghost is not just a killer. A ghost is a presence that appears on its own terms and leaves you questioning reality. Now we add the next layer, deception, because the Australians didn't only hide their presence. Sometimes they performed the opposite. Sometimes they broke the always be silent rule on purpose, just enough to be noticed, because they understood the enemy's psychology. If you want to catch a tracker, you don't hide perfectly. You show him something to follow. You give him confidence. You bait his pride. Then you decide where the fight happens. This is where they broke every rule becomes not just a tagline but a method. They broke the rule that says discipline always looks disciplined. Sometimes discipline looks like incompetence because incompetence is believable. So you leave a trace that's just sloppy enough to trigger the enemy's predatory instinct, but not so obvious that it screams trap. A broken branch, a wrapper, a footprint at the edge of a trail. Then you pull the enemy into a place you already own. And that's when the jungle stops being a neutral space. It becomes your kill box. This is where the Pentagon's discomfort spikes again. Because now we're not just talking about stealth, we're talking about manipulation. And manipulation in war is always morally hot. It's also incredibly effective. Because the enemy begins to question evidence. A footprint might be bait, a dropped object might be theater, a mistake might be a performance, so every tracker becomes slower. Every patrol becomes hesitant. Every commander becomes less confident. And in guerrilla war, confidence is logistics. Confidence is mobility. Confidence is survival. Now add the underground world. Because Vietnam wasn't only fought in trees, it was fought in dirt. And this is another place where American and Australian instincts diverged. When Americans encountered tunnel systems, the instinct was often to treat it as a close-quarters battle problem. Men go down, clear, fight in the dark. That created heroism, and created casualties, and created a psychological tax that destroyed units from the inside. The Australian mindset, as you framed in your scripts, treats tunnels like an engineering problem, an intelligence problem, and a denial problem. Where does it breathe? Where does it exit? Where does it connect? Which parts matter? And this is why the Australians kept producing disproportionate results. They didn't accept the battlefield the enemy wanted. They redesigned it. They weren't just hunters in the trees. They were forensic investigators of war. Now let's talk about the final reason the Pentagon hated them, because this is the one that stings the deepest. The Australians weren't only good at killing, they were good at not killing. They had restraint, not moral restraint, operational restraint. The ability to watch a target and let him pass because the bigger target is behind him. The ability to see a patrol and not engage because the engagement would compromise a larger mission. The ability to hold still for an hour because the cost of moving is too high. To the American system, that can look like passivity, but in the jungle, it's dominance. Because dominance is not who shoots first. Dominance is who decides when the shooting happens. And once the Australians achieved that, once they controlled when contact occurred, they controlled everything else. Now the story closes in on a final question, and it's the question your title demands. Why did the Pentagon hate this? Because it implied the United States could have fought differently. It implied that some of the war's failure wasn't about politics alone, or strategy alone, or public opinion alone. It implied that in certain environments, American doctrine was simply the wrong tool. And that is not a comfortable implication for a superpower. So they studied the Australians quietly. They borrowed what they could. They praised what was safe to praise. They downplayed what was controversial. They filed away what didn't fit. And years later, special operations forces around the world would adopt versions of these ideas. Signature control, long-range recon patience, deception. Psychological pressure, often stripped of the uncomfortable parts that made them work so well in the first place. Because modern militaries love tactics, but they fear psychology, they can teach you how to move. They struggle to teach you how to become the kind of person who can lie in mud, unmoving, while death sits 30 meters away and smokes a cigarette. They struggle to teach you how to be quiet in your soul, and that's the final rule the Australians broke. They proved that in Vietnam, silence was not the absence of power. Silence was power. Silence was the thing that made bombs feel clumsy. Silence was the scalpel that made the hammer look like a liability. The Americans brought an army. The Australians brought an idea. And the Pentagon hated it for the same reason. The Viet Cong feared it. Because once you accept that the jungle can be yours, once you accept that patience can be aggression, once you accept that control matters more than contact, then you have to admit something terrifying. The rules you've been living by were never laws. They were habits, and habits get men killed. The Pentagon didn't hate the Australians because they were reckless. They hated them because they were disciplined in a way that made American discipline look performative. Because the Australians didn't just avoid mistakes. They engineered situations where the enemy's instincts became mistakes. And once you understand that, the whole ghost myth stops sounding like superstition and starts sounding like a system. Imagine a Viet Cong unit that has done everything right by guerrilla standards. They've built tunnels, they've built bunkers, they've set trip wires and bamboo traps, they've mapped the trails. They've learned the American patterns, helicopters in, artillery softening, platoons moving loud, radios talking constantly, then extraction before the jungle closes again. They know that if they can just endure the noise, they can survive it, because the noise always leaves. And then one night, the jungle does something it's not supposed to do. It goes quiet. Not no shooting. Quiet like the insects keep singing because nothing feels wrong. Quiet like the birds don't lift. Quiet like the jungle hasn't been disturbed. Quiet like nobody is coming. Except someone is already inside the perimeter. That's the first escalation that breaks the enemy's mind, because guerrillas rely on early warning. They rely on time. They rely on hearing you before they see you. The Australians stole that time away. They showed up with no announcement. And when you steal warning time from a guerrilla, you steal his greatest advantage. Now picture the aftermath of a hit that isn't meant to be a firefight. It's meant to be a message. The bodies aren't just casualties. They're a broadcast. And the broadcast says one thing: your forest doesn't belong to you anymore. That message spreads faster than bullets. It spreads because it doesn't need a survivor to deliver it. It doesn't need radio traffic. It doesn't need paperwork. It just needs one patrol to walk into a scene that doesn't make sense. One man to look at his friend and feel, deep in his gut, that the jungle has become hostile in a way he can't negotiate with. And that is where the Pentagon's discomfort becomes visible, because this kind of warfare is effective precisely because it's intimate. It's close. It's human. It reaches inside morale and squeezes. A superpower can admit it bombed a hill. It can admit it killed a unit in a firefight. It can admit it lost men. Those are war facts. But it struggles to admit, out loud, that an ally won by frightening the enemy into paralysis, because that sounds too close to the thing we accuse insurgents of doing. So the Pentagon frames it as unconventional effectiveness. It studies it, it borrows what it can, and it keeps its distance from the parts that feel morally radioactive. But the Australians didn't keep their distance. They leaned into the psychology because they understood a truth that big war doctrine hates. The enemy isn't only a target. The enemy is an audience. Every engagement is theater whether you want it to be or not. The question is whether you control the theater or the theater controls you. The Australians controlled it. They didn't just kill men. They killed assumptions. And then they did something even more dangerous. They proved you could dominate an area without clearing it. That's a concept that sounds simple until you realize how much bureaucracy it destroys. Because clear is a word the Pentagon loves. Clear means measurable. Clear means lines on a map. Clear means you can brief it upstairs and justify resources. Clear means you can show progress. But the Australians weren't clearing. They were denying. They were making terrain psychologically expensive. They were making movement costly. They were making routine unsafe. They were turning the jungle into a place where the enemy could still exist, but could no longer function. And if you're a commander trained to win by mass and momentum, that's terrifying. Because it implies you don't need a battalion to control a valley. You need a handful of men who can sit in the dirt long enough to learn its secrets. This is where the story gets darker, because the Australians didn't do this by being superhuman. They did it by being systematic. They broke the rule that says stealth is passive. Their stealth was predatory. It was avoid contact because we fear contact. It was avoid contact because contact is currency. And we spend currency only when we get something strategic back. So they would watch a trail for hours and do nothing. Then watch it for another day. Then watch it through rain, through heat, through insects, through cramps, through thirst. Through the slow creeping doubt that begins whispering inside every human brain. This is pointless. We should move. We should do something. We should prove we're not wasting. And that's the moment the Pentagon's relationship with the Australians turns from curiosity into a problem. Because admiration is safe as long as it stays abstract. Admiration is safe as long as it stays in the realm of those guys are good in the bush. Admiration is safe as long as it doesn't force changes upstairs. But once American units start asking for the method, once liaison officers start requesting joint patrols specifically to learn how the Australians move, how they wait, how they control the jungle without announcing themselves, the Pentagon has to do something it hates, decide whether to endorse a weapon that doesn't look like one. And the thing is, the Australians weren't hiding the method. They weren't keeping it secret. In their world, it wasn't even a method. It was just how you survived long enough to win. But the Pentagon doesn't run on survival logic. It runs on policy logic, on directives, on what can be standardized and defended in a briefing. So the Australians become an institutional irritant because every time they succeed, they create two outcomes at once. Outcome 1, the enemy gets weaker. Outcome 2, the American way looks louder than it needs to be. And the louder it looks, the more questions rise. Why do we need helicopter noise for everything? Why do we need platoons walking shoulder to shoulder through terrain that punishes mass? Why do we need radio chatter in a place where static is a beacon? Why do we keep measuring progress with numbers that don't capture control? Then the Australians go a step further, because of course they do, and start weaponizing something most militaries treat as a side issue. They weaponize the enemy's imagination. This is where psychological dominance stops being a dramatic phrase and becomes a practical, repeatable effect. It starts with small signs. The kind that makes men look over their shoulders when they thought they were alone. A guard on a trail hears a twig snap, goes to investigate, finds nothing. But the sound doesn't feel like an animal. It feels like a test. A patrol comes back and realizes something on their perimeter is wrong. Not broken, not destroyed, just shifted. Like a hand reached into their camp while they were awake and dared them to notice. A unit finds footprints where there should be none. Or finds prints that appear and then stop, as if the walker vanished into the ground. And yes, the logical brain says this is just war stress, overactive nerves, hungry men seeing patterns in chaos. But guerrilla war is fought by humans, not by logic, and humans are storytelling machines. Under fear, we don't stop telling stories, we tell worse ones. Now imagine what this does inside a Viet Cong battalion. At first, the political cadre tries to control the narrative. He says the foreigners are frightened. He says these are isolated incidents. He says the jungle belongs to the revolution. He says discipline will fix it. But discipline doesn't fix an enemy you can't see. So the cadre's authority begins to leak away. Not because he's wrong, but because fear has its own chain of command. The young soldiers stop volunteering for night movement. The sentries stop trusting their ears, because every sound could be a ghost and every ghost could be a knife. Patrols tighten up, move slower, and begin acting like prey. And that's the moment the Australians have what they want. They've changed the enemy's posture. They've taken the enemy's natural advantage, confidence in the jungle, and replaced it with hesitation. And hesitation in guerrilla warfare is fatal because guerrillas live by momentum too, just a quieter kind of momentum. They need to move supplies. They need to move couriers. They need to move weapons. They need to move information. They need to move at night. They need to move unseen. Once you make them afraid of their own cover, you don't have to defeat them in battles. You defeat them in behavior. That is psychological dominance. And it is exactly the kind of dominance the Pentagon doesn't know what to do with. Because it doesn't fit the public script of, "We are the liberators with clean hands." Now the Australians add another layer, and it's the layer that splits American observers into two camps. The ones who call it genius, and the ones who call it something they can't put in writing. They start leaving messages, not propaganda leaflets dropped from aircraft, not loudspeaker broadcasts, messages in the battlefield language the enemy can't ignore, the aftermath of contact. Sometimes it's as simple as the pattern of what was taken and what was left. Sometimes it's a sign that the ambush wasn't random, that it was personal, deliberate, and controlled. And sometimes it's something more theatrical, because theater is the point. Theater is the lever that moves morale. This is where the Pentagon's moral discomfort becomes operational discomfort. Because once your ally starts using the enemy's fear system against him, superstition, folklore, the idea of spirits in the forest, you may be winning the jungle. But you're also creating a narrative risk. And the Pentagon's job, ultimately, is narrative control, so it tries to fence it off. It tries to keep it as their thing. It tries to prevent it from becoming our thing. Because if it becomes our thing, then it has to be justified, signed off, defended, and some of it can't be. Not because it isn't effective, because effectiveness is not the only currency for a superpower. Legitimacy is. That's why the Pentagon hated them, because the Australians were showing results in a way that made legitimacy complicated. Now here's the part most people miss. The Australians weren't out of control. They weren't random sadists. They weren't chaos. They were controlled enough to understand exactly where the line was, and exactly how close they could walk to it without crossing into pure noise. That's the difference between terror and psychological warfare. Terror is uncontrolled. It creates enemies. It creates blowback. It creates more resistance. It creates a cycle. Psychological warfare, when done well, is precise. It targets behavior. It targets decision-making. It targets the enemy's confidence with minimal force. The Australians' disturbing effectiveness came from the fact that they could be theatrical without becoming sloppy, and that kind of discipline is rare. Now, around this time, American units start attempting to imitate pieces of what they see. They try the calling cards without the patience. They try the intimidation without the invisibility. They try the idea of ghost war while still moving like a marching band. And because they don't have the same fieldcraft, the imitation becomes just that, imitation. And imitation is dangerous because it teaches the enemy the wrong lesson. It teaches the enemy to adapt to theater, not to the real mechanism. The real mechanism is not the card or the message. The real mechanism is uncertainty. The Australians didn't win because they left a symbol. They won because the enemy couldn't predict where the symbol would appear next. They won because the enemy couldn't find the men who placed it. They won because the enemy couldn't punish the act. That's the core of psychological dominance, action without consequence. Now the story escalates again, because once the enemy is pressured psychologically, he begins doing what pressured enemies always do. He becomes more brutal. He sets more traps. He deploys better trackers. He establishes tighter perimeters. He booby traps the obvious routes. He uses dogs when he can. He tries to create a rule system that will catch ghosts. And the Australians answer with the most insulting thing you can do to a rule system. They refuse to play it. They step around it. They go where you didn't prepare. They move when your sentries are mentally exhausted. They choose whether you think is too miserable for anyone to operate in monsoon rain, heavy enough to drown the world, and they use it as cover. Because here is another rule they broke. Most soldiers treat weather as friction. The Australians treated weather as a weapon. Rain kills scent. Rain kills sound. Rain kills visibility. Rain forces the enemy to hunch and shiver and focus inward. Rain makes men want to light fires, dry socks, get warm, get careless. Rain also makes the ground soft, which creates tracks. But if you're disciplined, you can manage tracks. If you're sloppy, tracks become a death sentence. So the Australians operate in the rain because they know the enemy's posture changes. They know the enemy's patience collapses faster. They know the enemy's sentries are less alert. They know the enemy's nerves are already raw. And then the Australians do the one thing a hunter does when prey is stressed. They tighten the pressure. This is where step-up tactics becomes more than a clever trick. It becomes a campaign method. It goes like this. You don't ambush just to kill the first group. You ambush to shape the movement of the survivors. You set your first strike to force retreat along the most likely escape route. Then you own that escape route. Then you own the fallback point. Then you own the rescue route. Then you own the commander's response. You turn the enemy's doctrine into a conveyor belt. And the enemy learns a new kind of fear. Not fear of contact, but fear of decisions. Because any decision could be predicted. Any retreat could be anticipated. Any rally point could be covered. Any counterattack could be bait. When soldiers start fearing their own standard operating procedure, they stop being soldiers. They become frightened bodies holding rifles. This is the effect that breaks units without destroying them. And again, this is the effect the Pentagon doesn't like to talk about publicly, because it implies the war could be won in ways that don't require massive formations. Now we're approaching the point where the story must pay off the title, because why the Pentagon hated them needs a final, clean answer. And the clean answer is this: the Australians were a living critique. They were proof that jungle counterinsurgency is not a math problem where you add firepower until the answer appears. It's a psychology problem. It's a pattern problem. It's an environment problem. It's a patience problem. The Pentagon hated them because the Australians were winning a kind of war that made the Pentagon's preferred war look like performance. But we still need the climax set piece, the moment that turns this from interesting doctrine clash into this changed modern warfare. And that moment is not a big battle. It's an impossible mission. Because impossible missions compress the truth. They reveal what matters. Here's how it happens. A message comes through that sounds like every other crisis message at first. An aircraft down, a lost asset, a missing person, a sensitive item. On paper, it looks like the kind of thing you solve with a big cordon, a big sweep, and a big show of force. But then you see the location, and every American commander's stomach tightens. Because the location isn't just behind enemy lines. It's inside a space where the enemy is thick enough to absorb a battalion. It's the kind of space where the helicopter noise that normally means help becomes a flare that says, "Come kill us." It's the kind of space where artillery support can't solve the problem without destroying the thing you're trying to recover. And that's when the American machine does what it often did in Vietnam when the math looked bad. It considers writing it off, not out of cowardice, out of calculation. Out of a doctrine that believes you do not spend a platoon to save one man. You do not risk large losses for small returns. You do not enter a meat grinder unless the return is strategic. But then the Australians step forward, not asking for a battalion, not asking for air cover, not asking for a parade of support. They ask for darkness, and that request tells you everything. Because darkness is their air cover, silence is their artillery, patience is their armor. Now picture the infiltration. 4 men moving like a rumor across the ground. No lights. No unnecessary gear noise. No radio chatter except what is absolutely required, and even then, done in the smallest possible way. They crawl where walking would expose them. They freeze where freezing hurts. They submerge where leeches attach and panic wants to rise. They bypass sentries not because sentries are incompetent, but because sentries are human, tired, wet, bored, focusing on the wrong slice of the darkness. And when the Australians reach the wreckage, they do the most brutal thing in terms of effort. They carry the problem out, not with helicopters, not with gunships, with muscles and time. And here is the key: they still don't fire, because to fire is to light the fuse of pursuit. To fire is to turn the jungle into a net closing around you. So they refuse, they move, they hide. They wait, they move again. They turn the exfiltration into a slow, suffocating test of will, because their doctrine understands something American doctrine often resisted. Sometimes you don't win by striking harder. You win by refusing to be detected long enough to leave. And when they return, with the asset, with the person, with the thing the Americans were prepared to bury, the American commander doesn't know how to react. Because the Australians did what the superpower couldn't do cleanly, and that's the payoff. Not Australians are better. The payoff is that a small team, using a different philosophy, succeeded inside the very environment where the superpower's advantages became liabilities. And once that happens, the Pentagon can't unsee it. Now we're in the final movement of the story, because the ending has to do what your reference scripts do. It has to land the doctrine lesson, then reveal the institutional reaction, then leave a legacy line that echoes. Here's the doctrine lesson, the one that becomes the spine of modern special operations thinking. Victory is not contact. Victory is control. Noise is a flare. Speed is exposure. A footprint is a confession, and panic wastes oxygen. Those aren't slogans. They're survival math. Now the Pentagon's reaction. The Pentagon doesn't publicly announce, "We were wrong." It doesn't say, "Our ally embarrassed our doctrine." It doesn't say, "The war demanded a scalpel and we kept swinging a hammer." Instead, it does what big institutions always do. It absorbs quietly. It studies the Australians. It borrows the pieces it can justify: stealth movement, long-range patrol habits, signature management, better ambush patience, intelligence-first priorities. It tries to bake those pieces into training, but something gets lost, because tactics can be copied. Psychology is harder. The Australian method requires men who can endure boredom without creating noise, who can endure fear without turning it into movement, who can endure discomfort without scratching, who can endure uncertainty without needing to do something just to feel alive. That emotional register, the calm, predatory patience, is what outsiders struggle to replicate. And that's why the Australians felt like ghosts even to allies, because they were operating at a different temperature. Now we close with the payoff you've been building from the beginning: why the Pentagon hated them. The Pentagon hated them because they broke every rule that made the American way look legitimate. They broke the rule that said bigger units equal safer units. They broke the rule that said movement equals progress. They broke the rule that said firepower equals dominance. They broke the rule that said you take the shot when you have it. They broke the rule that said the jungle belongs to the guerrilla. They broke the rule that said psychological warfare is something you do with leaflets and speakers instead of patience and presence. And by breaking those rules, they forced a truth into the open. In Vietnam, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a bomb. It was a man who could wait. And the most terrifying battlefield wasn't the one you could bomb. It was the one you couldn't even see. The jungle has grown back over those trails. The bomb craters filled with rain. The bunkers collapsed. The old paths turned into green blur again, but the lesson didn't disappear. Because every time a modern operator holds his breath, stays still longer than feels human, lets a target pass to catch the network behind it, moves without noise, communicates without speaking, and treats fear as a signal to slow down instead of speed up, Every time that happens, the Australian rule-breaking lives again. The Americans brought an army to Vietnam. They brought noise and fire and tonnage and certainty. The Australians brought a nightmare, quiet enough to slip through the war without being recorded properly, controversial enough to be downplayed, effective enough to be copied anyway. And the Pentagon hated them for the same reason the enemy feared them, because they proved the war had different rules. And once you learn those rules, you can't go back to pretending the old ones were laws.